was a smooth ride. It was a very smooth ride. I think Ike and I maybe saw 2 moments of a touch of char loss. Certainly when we went up to the vehicle, there was a little bit of char loss on what's called the shoulder, which is kind of where the heat shield meets the structure of the cone shape of the spacecraft.
After the Artemis II mission splashed down, everyone was obviously relieved that the crew made it back safely. But it also made one thing pretty clear to NASA. The Orion spacecraft is going to need a better thermal protection system going forward. So that's what we're getting into today. What can NASA actually do to improve Orion's heat shield? And is it possible to replace it with a better design altogether? After their historic flight, the astronauts from NASA's Artemis II mission say their trip around the moon and back was a pretty smooth ride overall. Still, the mission commander did mention spotting a bit of charring on a key part of the Orion capsule's heat shield after re-entry. The 4-person crew splashed down in the Pacific last Friday, wrapping up a nearly 10-day test flight. During the mission, they traveled farther into space than any humans have in decades, looping around the moon's far side inside their gumdrop-shaped Orion capsule. Coming home was no small feat. The capsule slammed into Earth's atmosphere at around 32 times the speed of sound, a critical test for the Lockheed Martin-built Orion spacecraft, which NASA plans to use again for another mission next year. "We came in fast and we came in hot," Commander Reed Wiseman said in the crew's first press conference after returning. NASA initially reported a peak re-entry speed of about 24,664 miles per hour, Mach 32. Just shy of the record set during Apollo 10 back in 1969. But pilot Victor Glover later said the onboard displays showed an even higher speed, closer to Mach 38.9. He noted that measuring speed in space isn't exactly straightforward, so NASA may update the final numbers later. Glover described the whole re-entry as a very intense 13 minutes and 36 seconds. After the initial atmospheric braking, parachutes kicked in to slow things down further. At one point, when the first set of chutes detached, the capsule briefly went back into freefall. Glover compared it to diving backward off a skyscraper. Definitely not your average ride. Once they were safely recovered at sea, the crew got a closer look at the capsule. Wiseman said he noticed a little bit of char loss along the edge, what's called the shoulder, of the heat shield. Both he and Glover said they caught a couple of moments during re-entry where that charring seemed to occur. Photos taken afterward showed a noticeable white mark in that area, but NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman wasn't too concerned. He said the heat shield performed pretty much as expected, behaving similarly to what they'd already seen in high-temperature ground tests. As you probably know, this isn't the first time Orion's heat shield has raised concerns during re-entry. Back on the uncrewed Artemis I mission in 2022, the capsule came back with more damage than NASA expected. Small cracks, bits of charred material flaking off. Enough to trigger a pretty intense 2-year investigation. Interestingly, NASA didn't redesign or replace the heat shield for Artemis II. Instead, they adjusted how the spacecraft comes home. This time, they chose a steeper re-entry path to shorten the amount of time Orion spends in those extreme, high-temperature conditions, basically reducing how long the heat shield is under the most stress. And to be fair, NASA leadership knew this part of the mission would be the most dangerous. The final stretch, those last 100 miles back to Earth, is where everything really gets tested. A few days before splashdown, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman even admitted his blood pressure wouldn't settle until the crew was safely back. There's no backup plan here. The heat shield just has to work. Isaacman also pointed out something interesting in a post on X. He noted that Administrator Bill Nelson stated in December 2024, 2 years after Artemis I flew, that we would refly the same heat shield design on Artemis II, yet the mission did not fly until April 2026. On a side note, if leadership knew at the time that Artemis II would not launch until April 2026, it probably would have made sense to replace the heat shield altogether. Long story short, with the Artemis program finally getting into full swing and plans to eventually launch lunar missions as often as once a year, NASA needs a new, more robust heat shield for future trips to the moon. So when people start talking about a new heat shield for Orion, a lot of eyes immediately turn to SpaceX Crew Dragon. mainly because its heat shield has built up a really solid track record over multiple missions. And interestingly, Orion's own heat shield story is actually tied, at least a little, to the same material choices behind Dragon. Avcoat heat shield material was originally used for the Apollo heat shield. But back in the Apollo program, that heat shield was a single-piece structure with a honeycomb design where each cell had to be filled in by hand. It worked, but it was a slow and very labor-intensive process. When NASA tried to scale that up for Orion, especially during Exploration Flight Test 1 in 2014, they found that the larger heat shield was more prone to cracking. The Avcoat, which gets injected into those honeycomb cells as a thick putty, can develop cracks as it cures. That's what pushed them to move toward a block-based design instead. At the same time, NASA did look at an alternative material called pica heat shield material, which is used on things like the Perseverance rover, the Curiosity rover, and, you get it, Crew Dragon. But they ended up rejecting it. The main reason was that pica would have required a block-style heat shield, and at the time, there weren't any proven gap fillers to seal the spaces between those blocks. Ironically, when NASA later switched Orion to a block design using Avcoat, they still had to deal with that exact problem anyway. And in general, once you go with a segmented heat shield, things just get more complicated. You can run into all kinds of unexpected behavior during re-entry. The interesting thing is, SpaceX Crew Dragon doesn't just use regular pica. It uses an upgraded version called Pica X heat shield material. This version was designed to be cheaper, more practical, and most importantly, reusable. The original pica heat shield material was already impressive, super lightweight and capable of handling intense re-entry heat, but it wasn't really built with fast turnaround or low cost in mind. What really stands out about Pica-X is its physical performance. It's extremely light, with a density of about 0.27 grams per cubic centimeter, almost like cork. And that matters because every kilogram you send to space costs money. So the lighter your spacecraft, the cheaper it is to launch. Despite that low weight, it can handle temperatures of around 1,850 degrees Celsius during re-entry, while still keeping the inside of the capsule at safe, near-room temperatures. Even more impressive, it only needs to be a few centimeters thick, roughly around 6 centimeters, to do the job, which really shows how efficient the material is. Like Orion's current heat shield, the way Dragon's Pica-X works is through ablation. Instead of completely blocking heat, it basically sacrifices its outer layer. The material is made of carbon fibers infused with a phenolic resin, and during re-entry, that resin burns off and carries heat away. As it burns, it leaves behind a charred carbon layer that keeps insulating the spacecraft underneath. The key detail is that only a very small amount of material, less than a centimeter, is lost each time. That's why it can actually be reused to some extent. And that reusability is a huge advantage. Older systems, like the fragile tile-based heat shields on the Space Shuttle, which contributed to disasters like the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, needed tons of inspection and repair after every flight. Pica-X, on the other hand, can be refurbished much more easily by just removing that thin, charred layer and flying again. That makes it way more practical for frequent missions, which is exactly where modern spaceflight is heading. Another big advantage is cost. SpaceX managed to produce Pica-X at roughly 10 times lower cost than the original Pica, while also making it easier to manufacture. That combination, lower cost, strong performance, and partial reusability, is what makes it so important. It's not just a better heat shield on its own, it's a key piece of tech that helps make sustainable, scalable spaceflight actually possible. I know what people are thinking. Right now, SpaceX Crew Dragon mostly acts like a space taxi going to and from the ISS. So can its heat shield really handle deep space missions? The truth is, SpaceX actually designed Dragon's thermal protection system to go way beyond simple orbital re-entry. From the start, its heat shield, based on Pica-X heat shield material, was built to handle the kind of extreme heat and stress you'd get from a direct return to Earth from Mars. That was always part of the long-term vision. even if Dragon itself isn't flying those missions today. Because of that, some people argue that if NASA ever wants to push Orion into deeper space roles beyond the Moon, it might make sense to look at something similar. Of course, the biggest challenge here is time. NASA wants to get the next Moon mission flying as soon as next year, and completely changing Orion's heat shield material isn't exactly a quick swap. It's a huge redesign, testing, and certification effort. That said, there have been some pretty interesting ideas floating around. One suggestion is to run a relatively low-cost test by teaming up with SpaceX. The idea would be to launch a Dragon capsule on a high-speed re-entry trajectory using a Falcon Heavy, similar to how Orion was originally tested with a Delta IV Heavy. That way, you could actually see how Pika X heat shield material performs under true lunar return conditions. And to make it even more interesting, some have suggested splitting the test, like replacing part of Dragon's heat shield with Avcoat heat shield material blocks, so you'd get a direct side-by-side comparison during the same flight. As of now, the Artemis III mission is expected to fly with a new version of Orion's heat shield that NASA is currently working on. It's still based on the same Avcoat approach, but with an important tweak. They're developing a more permeable material that lets trapped gases escape during high-temperature re-entry. The idea is to prevent pressure buildup inside the blocks, which is one of the things that can lead to cracking or structural issues. Now, it's not totally clear if that alone will fix everything. But honestly, it is good to see NASA starting to move toward a slightly more hardware-rich approach. Jared Isaacman has been pretty direct about this. He said that while the Artemis II mission team did solid analysis on the current heat shield, it's probably not the long-term solution. Going forward, NASA needs to start looking at alternatives. That's not the perfect approach, he said. If this were the 1960s, we'd be building so many heat shields and capsules that if something didn't look right, we'd just swap it out and move on. And that kind of flexibility is exactly what the private sector does well, especially companies like SpaceX. Isaacman even pointed to his own experience flying on a Crew Dragon during the Polaris Dawn mission. Before launch, there was an issue with a Falcon 9 second stage during testing. Instead of delaying everything, SpaceX just rolled it aside and used another one. Problem solved. That's what he means by being hardware-rich, having enough flight hardware ready to go so you're not stuck waiting on a single component to be perfect. NASA actually worked like this back in the Apollo program, building and testing at a much faster pace. And now, they're trying to get some of that speed and flexibility back.